Pack your bags. This house has no room for a leech. The words echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the grand foyer, the very same ceilings I had spent 6 agonizing months designing with our architect, ensuring the morning light would hit the imported Italian marble just right. I stood frozen by the massive mahogany double doors, staring down at the matching Louis Vuitton luggage set I had bought Marcus for our 5th wedding anniversary. He had casually, almost playfully kicked one of the heavy bags toward my feet. Beside him stood Chloe. She was 22, blonde, and wearing my favorite silk morning robe, the one I had paid $300 for during a business trip to Milan. Chloe crossed her arms tightly, leaning her entire body weight against my husband's shoulder. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust, like I was a stubborn stain on the pristine tile she couldn't figure out how to wipe away. She was supposed to be the maid. She was supposed to be the struggling, bright-eyed college student I was mentoring. The girl I was paying $3,000 a month just to help keep the house tidy while I managed my companies. "Did you hear her, Maya?" Marcus adjusted his tailored suit cuffs, refusing to meet my eyes. It was a habit he had whenever he was guilty, though right now he was trying desperately to project absolute authority. The suit he was wearing was one I had paid for. "It is time for you to go. You have leeched off my success long enough." I should have been on my knees. I should have been begging the man I had loved for 15 years to tell me this was all some kind of sick, twisted joke. I could feel the cold draft from the front window seeping through my thin cashmere sweater. I could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking heavily in the hallway. Every single second felt dense thick with the weight of a betrayal so profound it actually knocked the wind out of my lungs. But then, looking at her smug face and his arrogant, puffed-out chest, the final piece of a very ugly puzzle snapped firmly into place. The missing money from our accounts, the whispered phone calls taken out in the garage, the way she had been slowly, methodically taking over my kitchen, my daily schedule, my husband. Suddenly, the entire nightmare made perfect, terrifying sense. I didn't cry. Instead, a slow, quiet smile spread across my face. "What is so funny?" Chloe snapped her perfectly manicured fingers, tightening aggressively on Marcus's sleeve. "You are getting thrown out on the street. There is nothing funny about being a broke, middle-aged loser." I kept smiling, but my mind drifted far away from the cold marble floors and the glittering crystal chandelier above us. The polished, flawless surfaces of my present reality dissolved, replaced instantly by the sharp burning scent of industrial bleach and the agonizing, constant ache in my lower back. 15 years ago, there was no marble. There was only linoleum, scuffed and heavily stained, stretching down the endless corridors of the downtown office buildings I cleaned every single night. I was 22 years old, a young African-American woman with a heavy mop bucket and a dream that felt 10 sizes too big for my gritty reality. Marcus was a first-year law student back then. He had the brains, the easy charm, and the relentless burning drive to change the world. What he didn't have was a single dime to his name. His wealthy family had made it clear they wouldn't support him, leaving him drowning in student loans and daily panic attacks. So I stepped up. That is what you do when you love someone, isn't it? You carry their heavy weight when their knees start to buckle. I started Maya's commercial cleaning with 2 cheap mops, a borrowed vacuum cleaner, and a stack of black and white flyers I printed at the public library. While Marcus sat at our wobbly kitchen table studying torts and contracts wrapped in a warm blanket, I was on my hands and knees scraping dried gum off baseboards in corporate bathrooms. I worked from 6 in the evening until 3 in the morning. Then I would come home, sleep for 4 fitful hours, and spend the day pitching my cleaning services to property managers who barely gave me the time of day. My hands were perpetually raw, cracked, and peeling from the harsh chemicals. I wore the same 3 threadbare shirts for 2 solid years, so Marcus could buy the right designer suits for his firm interviews. I vividly remember a freezing Tuesday in December. We had exactly $14 in our joint checking account. Marcus was sobbing on our living room floor, completely broken under the crushing pressure of his final exams and our mounting utility bills. I held him on our lumpy mattress, stroking his hair, promising him over and over that I would handle it. And I did handle it. I took on 3 more massive office buildings. I worked until my vision blurred and my leg muscles screamed in protest. Every single dime I made went into his tuition, his textbooks, his future. I believed in him with a fierce, unwavering ferocity that bordered on religious devotion. But I wasn't just working for him. I was quietly, methodically building my own independent empire. The commercial cleaning business grew. I hired a crew, then another. I started paying close attention to the local real estate market, listening carefully to the wealthy property managers I contracted with. By the time Marcus finally passed the bar exam, I had bought my first commercial space in cash. When he landed his first official job as a junior associate, I bought my second property. I was flipping commercial spaces, managing a massive cleaning staff, and building a real estate portfolio that was quietly generating serious generational wealth. Marcus knew I was doing well, but he never really paid attention to the tedious details of my work. To him and to his elitist mother, I was always just the blue-collar girl with the mop. He saw the comfortable money flowing into our joint accounts, but he never respected the exhausting grind that produced it. He started wearing expensive watches. He bought a luxury sports car. He started talking down to service workers at restaurants, conveniently forgetting that his own wife had scrubbed public toilets to pay for his fancy law degree. The emotional distance between us grew slowly, like a silent crack in a foundation that you intentionally ignore until the entire house starts leaning. I poured unconditional love into that widening gap. I tried desperately to be the perfect corporate wife. I hosted his lavish dinners, smiled politely at his arrogant partners, and kept my hands professionally manicured so no one would see the lingering, faded scars of my early hustle. When he said I was working far too hard and suggested we hire a live-in maid, I thought he was finally showing genuine concern for my well-being. I had no idea he was simply making room for his young mistress. He brought Chloe into our sanctuary under the guise of helping me manage my stress. I wrote her $3,000 paycheck every single month from my business account. I bought her organic groceries, let her drive my backup car, and treated her like a younger sister who needed a mentor in a tough city. I honestly thought I was paying for peace of mind and an extra set of hands. I was actually funding my own replacement. The sharp, impatient sound of Marcus clearing his throat pulled me violently back from the bitter memories. The phantom smell of bleach vanished from my nose, replaced by the heavy, suffocating scent of Chloe's expensive perfume. My perfume, actually. She had been stealing it directly from my master bathroom vanity. "We are waiting, Maya," Marcus said, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. He looked so incredibly proud of himself, so impossibly smug. "I have a professional moving crew coming tomorrow morning to clear out whatever junk you decide to leave behind. I strongly suggest you call a cab right now." I looked at the man I had given my absolute best years to. The man whose very success was built entirely on the calluses of my tired hands. He genuinely believed he had won this game. He believed that because he wore a fancy suit and carried a leather briefcase, he was the untouchable master of this universe. He had completely and utterly underestimated the woman standing in front of him. I pressed my fingernails into my palms until they ached. 15 years of devotion had just been tossed aside for a 22-year-old girl in my silk robe. I swallowed the thick lump in my throat, refusing to let them see my hands shake. The scared girl who scrubbed floors for survival was long gone. The woman who stood here now was forged in absolute fire. "You are going to call a cab," Chloe taunted, taking a bold step toward me. She gestured wildly around the grand foyer, her eyes wide with fake authority. "You do not belong in a place like this. You never did. Marcus needs a woman who matches his professional status, not some tired old floor scrubber. I let her nasty words hang heavily in the air. I let the tense silence stretch until it became physically uncomfortable watching the false confidence flicker slightly in Chloe's wide eyes. I looked from her cheap, smug expression to my husband's cowardly stance. Actually, I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. I took a deliberate, slow step forward, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I think there is a very slight misunderstanding about who exactly is leaving today. Marcus rolled his eyes dramatically, letting out a heavy, exasperated sigh that echoed in the large room. Do not make this harder than it already has to be, Maya. We are getting a divorce. I am keeping the house and the assets. End of discussion. You cannot keep something that does not belong to you, I replied, holding his gaze without blinking. The sudden confusion on his face was deeply, profoundly satisfying. For a fleeting second, I saw genuine panic flash behind his arrogant blue eyes. He looked at Chloe, then back at me, his stiff posture faltering just a fraction. What are you talking about? Chloe demanded, her voice rising in a shrill, nervous pitch. Marcus is a senior partner at his law firm. He pays for everything in this house. I kept my eyes locked on my husband, enjoying the quiet, lethal power of the moment. I savored the way his breath hitched. Actually, Chloe, this house belongs to... Before I could finish the sentence, Marcus reached frantically inside his tailored suit jacket. His movements were jerky, suddenly stripped of their smooth, practiced confidence. He pulled out a thick, folded piece of legal paper and held it up between us like a physical shield. He shook the document at me, a desperate, manic grin spreading across his face. You really thought I was stupid, didn't you? Marcus sneered, stepping right into my personal space. You thought you could hide your little real estate empire from a corporate lawyer. He thrust the heavy paper toward my chest. I glanced down, my heart stalling completely in my rib cage. It was a certified property deed for the house, and right there, sitting stark and black on the bottom line, was my unmistakable signature signing full and exclusive ownership entirely over to him. I stared at the black ink looping across the bottom of the deed. It was my signature. The slant of the M, the sharp, aggressive tail of the Y, it was a flawless forgery. My brain struggled to process the sheer, terrifying calculation required to pull this off. This wasn't an impulsive act of cruelty. This was a long, meticulous game. To understand how a man steals your life, you have to understand how he first makes you feel guilty for building it. The shift in our marriage started 2 years ago. My commercial real estate firm, Vanguard Properties, had finally hit its stride. I was closing multi-million-dollar acquisitions, flying high on the adrenaline of watching my childhood dreams materialize into concrete and glass. Marcus, meanwhile, had hit a brick wall. His law firm had passed him over for senior partner again. While my phone rang constantly with eager investors, his sat silent. The resentment bred quietly in the shadows of our home. It lived in his tight jaw during my business calls and echoed in the heavy sighs he let out when I worked on weekends. I felt a crushing, misplaced guilt. I loved him, and seeing his ego bruised made my own success taste like ash. I tried to compensate. I bought him tailored suits and paid cash for a luxury sports car, hoping to bandage his insecurities. It only fed his toxic pride. Then came his brilliant solution for our marital strain. You are burning out, Maya, he said one evening, swirling a glass of scotch. You work too hard. You need help managing this massive house. I pushed back. I loved my privacy and found peace in taking care of my sanctuary. But Marcus was relentless, insisting a woman of my status shouldn't be scrubbing baseboards. He claimed he had already found the perfect candidate, a bright, struggling college girl who desperately needed a break. Enter Chloe. The day she moved into our guest suite, my intuition screamed. She didn't look like a struggling student. She arrived wearing designer jeans, a tight cashmere sweater, and a cloud of heavy perfume. She didn't look at my home with the polite awe of an employee. She looked around with a cold, calculating hunger. During her brief introduction, she ignored professional boundaries, calling my husband Marcus right out of the gate while twirling her blonde hair. I suppressed my alarm, wanting to be the supportive wife who lifted another woman up. On her first day, I wrote her a check for $3,000. Marcus called it a generous advance for tuition. I smiled as I handed it to her, believing I was funding an education. I didn't know I was financing my own psychological torture. The reality of living with Chloe set in like a slow-acting poison. She didn't clean, she lounged. I would come home after a brutal 12-hour day to find the sink piled high with dishes. Chloe would be stretched out on my expensive patio furniture, scrolling through her phone. If I politely asked her to run an errand, she would let out a dramatic sigh and drag her feet as if moving mountains. Worse was her blatant disrespect. She started rearranging my kitchen cabinets and bought cheap, sugary groceries with the allowance I provided, completely ignoring my careful organic meal plans. When I finally brought my frustrations to Marcus, he flipped the script with terrifying ease. "She is practically a kid, Maya," he argued, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are being overly critical. You expect everyone to operate with your ruthless corporate efficiency. Try showing a little grace." He made me feel harsh, unforgiving, and paranoid. He twisted my valid complaints into personal character flaws, so I swallowed my irritation and tiptoed around my own house to keep the peace. The atmosphere grew increasingly claustrophobic, reaching its peak during our Sunday dinners with Eleanor, Marcus's mother. Eleanor had always viewed my blue-collar beginnings with thinly veiled disgust, never forgiving me for having calloused hands when I first met her son. During one particular dinner, Eleanor sat at my custom dining table sipping the imported wine I had purchased. She was eating a beautiful roasted chicken I had paid a private chef to prepare because Chloe had conveniently forgotten to grocery shop. "It is so wonderful to finally have a youthful domestic energy in this house," Eleanor crooned, patting Chloe's hand. "Marcus always needed a nurturing presence to come home to. Maya is always so horribly stressed with her little buildings." Chloe smiled, a demure, sickeningly sweet smile. "I just want to make sure Marcus is properly taking care of Mrs. Sterling." I gripped my linen napkin under the table until my fingers went numb. I looked at the man I had sacrificed my youth for, waiting for him to defend me. Marcus just took another bite of his dinner, smiled at Chloe, and nodded in agreement. The microaggressions slowly evolved into a suffocating paranoia. The signs of their affair were everywhere, carelessly masked as innocent interactions. I vividly remember coming downstairs for a glass of water late one Thursday night. The house was dead silent. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard muffled laughter coming from the kitchen. I crept forward, peering around the corner. The room was dark, illuminated only by the under-cabinet lighting. Marcus and Chloe were standing by the refrigerator. They were mere inches apart. His voice was a low, intimate murmur. She threw her head back and laughed softly, resting her hand flat against the center of his chest. I cleared my throat. They sprang apart instantly, jumping back like startled deer. "Just giving her some advice on her business classes." Marcus stammered, his voice a pitch too high, his eyes wide and defensive. I didn't say a word. I poured my water and went back upstairs, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I lay in the dark for hours, staring at the ceiling. I told myself I was crazy. I forced myself to believe his lies because acknowledging the truth meant tearing down the 15 years I had invested in our life. When you love someone deeply, you willfully choose to be blind. A few weeks later, our wedding anniversary approached. The tension in the house was thick enough to choke on, but I wanted desperately to hit the reset button. The morning of our anniversary, I was gathering items for the dry cleaner. I picked up the heavy wool overcoat Marcus had worn to a client dinner the night before. As I checked the pockets, my fingers brushed against a stiff piece of paper. I pulled it out, expecting a coffee receipt. It was a printed receipt from an exclusive high-end jeweler downtown. The total at the bottom made my breath catch in my throat. $12,000, paid in cash. My eyes scanned up to the item description: diamond and platinum tennis bracelet. A massive wave of guilt washed over me, swift and heavy. I had been suspecting him of the worst, doubting his love and questioning his late nights. Yet here he was, planning the grandest romantic gesture of our entire marriage. He wasn't pulling away. He was trying to fix us. I carefully folded the receipt and tucked it back into his pocket, my heart soaring with a renewed foolish hope. I spent the rest of the day practically floating, getting my hair done and anticipating our dinner. That evening, we sat at a candlelit table in the most exclusive restaurant in the city. The waiter poured our champagne, and Marcus reached into his tailored suit jacket. He slid a small, flat, rectangular box across the white tablecloth. My brow furrowed. The box wasn't the right shape or weight for a diamond tennis bracelet. It was far too large and entirely too light. I lifted the lid with trembling fingers, my stomach dropping into a bottomless pit. Inside the box lay a thin, generic silk scarf. It was the exact kind of cheap, mass-produced accessory you buy at a department store checkout counter for $40. I stared at the flimsy fabric pooling in my hands. The edges were already fraying. It felt rough, cheap, and entirely insulting. The $12,000 receipt for a diamond tennis bracelet was still burned into my memory, sitting like a lead weight in the pit of my stomach. I looked up at Marcus. He was smiling, raising his champagne glass as if he had just presented me with the crown jewels. I thanked him. I put the scarf around my neck, feeling like it was actively choking me, and survived the rest of the dinner. The next morning, the subtle Cold War in my home shifted into open, hostile territory. Chloe no longer bothered to maintain the quiet, submissive maid persona. The mask slipped completely. She began treating my house like her own personal playground. I came downstairs one Tuesday to find my reading sanctuary, a small, sunlit corner of the living room I used for reviewing real estate contracts, completely dismantled. My heavy oak desk had been shoved against the wall. My hand-loomed Persian rug, the one I had bought to celebrate my first $1 million closing, was rolled up and tossed into a corner like trash. "Chloe!" I called out, my voice tight with suppressed anger. She sauntered into the room, holding a mug of my expensive imported coffee. She was wearing a pair of my designer yoga pants. They were a little too long on her, dragging slightly on the hardwood floors I had paid to restore. "What happened in here?" I asked, pointing to the ruined room. "Oh, I needed more space for my morning stretches," she said casually, taking a sip of the coffee. "The energy in this corner was just totally blocked. It feels much better now, doesn't it?" Before I could process her sheer audacity, I noticed a dark, spreading stain on the cream-colored upholstery of my favorite reading chair. "Is that red wine?" I asked, stepping closer. Chloe sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes as if I were bothering her. "It was a total accident. I was studying in here last night and my glass just tipped over. I scrubbed it with some bleach, but it wouldn't come out." Bleach on a custom-upholstered silk chair. "You are fired," I said. The words tasted metallic and absolute. "Pack your things. I want you out of my house by noon." Chloe didn't flinch. She didn't cry or beg for her job. She just offered me a slow, wicked little smile and walked straight past me toward the kitchen. I marched directly into Marcus's home office. He was on his laptop, looking relaxed in his weekend casuals. I slammed the door shut behind me, the sound cracking like a whip through the quiet house. "Chloe is done," I said, leaning over his desk. "She ruined my custom chair with bleach. She is wearing my clothes, and she is rearranging the house. I just fired her." Marcus froze. His relaxed posture vanished instantly, replaced by a rigid, aggressive tension. He stood up, towering over me. "You did what?" His voice was dangerously low. "I fired the maid," I repeated, holding my ground. "She is destructive and disrespectful." "You are not firing anyone, Maya," he snapped, pointing a sharp finger at my chest. "I hired her. She stays. She works for me. I raised my voice, the frustration finally breaking through my carefully maintained calm. I am the one writing her $3,000 checks every month from Vanguard Properties. She is destroying my home. Marcus let out a cruel, mocking laugh. He stepped around the desk, backing me toward the door. Listen to yourself, he sneered. You are completely paranoid. You work 80 hours a week, you're exhausted, and you are taking your stress out on a helpless kid. She is not a kid, Marcus. She is 22, and she knows exactly what she is doing. You are jealous, he said, dropping the ultimate psychological bomb. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure, calculated pity. You are threatened by a young, vibrant girl who actually knows how to relax. You resent her youth. You need to get a grip on reality, Maya. Chloe is essential to keeping this household running. She is not going anywhere. He opened his office door and gestured for me to leave. The dismissal was absolute. He had chosen to protect the employee over his own wife. I walked out of his office with my pulse hammering in my ears. I felt like I was losing my mind. Was I being unreasonable? Was I just a bitter, overworked woman seeing ghosts where there were none? Then my business instincts kicked in. I didn't build a real estate empire by ignoring my gut. When the numbers don't add up, you audit the ledger. I went straight to my laptop and pulled up our joint checking account. I usually ignored it, simply transferring enough money every month to cover the massive mortgage and the exorbitant utilities while I focused on my corporate accounts. I scrolled through the past 3 months of transactions. A freezing knot tightened in my stomach. There were cash withdrawals, $500 here, $800 there, always from an ATM just blocks from Marcus's law firm. Over $12,000 in unaccounted cash was missing over a 90-day period. It was a slow, deliberate bleed. I needed proof. I needed to see exactly what was happening in my sanctuary when I was locked in my office or out at dusty construction sites. During my lunch break the next day, I drove to an electronics store a few towns over. I paid cash for a high-definition motion-activated security camera hidden inside a sleek digital clock. When I got home, the house was empty. I placed the clock on the console table in the main upstairs hallway. It had a perfect, unobstructed view of the master bedroom, Marcus's office, and the sweeping staircase leading down to the foyer. I connected it to a secure hidden application on my phone. Then I went back to work and waited. 3 agonizing days passed. I played the part of the chastised, exhausted wife perfectly. I ignored Chloe when she left her dirty dishes in the sink. I smiled at Marcus over dinner, pouring his wine and asking about his day. On Thursday night, while Marcus was supposedly working late and Chloe was allegedly studying in her room, I locked the door to my home office. I opened the security app on my phone and pulled up the archived footage. I watched hours of empty hallways. Then the timestamp hit 2:14 p.m. from the previous afternoon. The motion sensor triggered. The hallway lit up on my screen. Marcus walked out of his home office. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His tie was loosened. A few seconds later, Chloe walked up the stairs. She wasn't carrying cleaning supplies or laundry. She was carrying a thick manila folder. I held my breath, pressing my face closer to the glowing screen. They met in the middle of the hallway. They didn't embrace. There was no passionate kiss or stolen moment of romance. Instead, their interaction was intensely, terrifyingly clinical. Chloe opened the folder. She pointed to a specific document, whispering something to Marcus. He nodded, pulling a pen from his pocket, and quickly signed the paper against the wall. He handed it back to her. She slid it into the folder, gave him a sharp, confirming nod, and walked briskly back down the stairs. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. That wasn't a mistress demanding attention. That was a transaction. That was a coordinated, deliberate exchange of financial documents. They weren't just having an affair behind my back. They were conducting business. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My entire reality tilted on its axis. I was housing a parasite, and my husband was holding the door open for her. I needed to know exactly what was in that folder. The next day, Friday, I was scheduled to be on site at a new commercial property until 7 in the evening. I told Marcus I would be home late, ensuring he felt completely secure in his privacy. Instead, I canceled my afternoon meetings. I parked my car 3 blocks away and walked back to my own house at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The neighborhood was dead silent. The afternoon sun beat down on the manicured lawns. I slipped through the side gate, moving quietly across the grass toward the back patio. The main house was completely dark and locked tight, but as I crept past the swimming pool, I noticed the heavy blackout curtains in the detached guest house were pulled tightly shut. I stopped breathing. The guest house was Chloe's domain. I moved silently across the stone pavers, pressing my back against the warm stucco wall near her front window. I could hear muffled voices coming from inside. It was Marcus. His tone wasn't romantic. It was low, urgent, and heavily focused. "We need to move the Vanguard assets before she catches on," he said, his voice filtering through the thick glass. "The LLC is set up, but the transfers have to look clean." "I have the account routing numbers," Chloe's voice replied, sounding sharp and entirely professional. "Just keep her distracted for 2 more weeks." A cold tremor shot through my fingers. My own husband was plotting to drain my companies. I stepped away from the window and walked slowly up to the guest house door. I reached out, wrapping my trembling hand around the heavy brass handle. I pressed down slowly, intending to rip the door open and confront the nightmare hiding inside my own backyard. The handle stopped with a heavy metallic clunk. It was locked from the inside. I pulled my hand back from the heavy brass handle, as if the metal were blistering hot. The muffled voices inside the guest house continued, low and conspiratorial, separated from me by a single pane of frosted glass. Every instinct I possessed, every ounce of wounded pride and betrayed love, screamed at me to kick that door off its hinges. I wanted to shatter the glass. I wanted to drag them both out into the harsh afternoon daylight and demand an explanation. My chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. I could practically feel the adrenaline burning in my veins. But then a cold, hard voice cut through the chaos in my mind. It was the voice of the woman who had built a multi-million-dollar empire from a single mop bucket. "You do not win a war by throwing a tantrum. You win by gathering leverage." I backed away from the door, ensuring my steps were completely silent on the stone pavers. The afternoon sun beat down on my shoulders, but I felt like I was encased in solid ice. I slipped back through the side gate, walking the 3 long blocks to where I had parked my car. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely get the key into the ignition. That night, the psychological torture truly began. I lay perfectly still in our massive king-sized bed, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. Marcus was fast asleep beside me. For 15 years, the steady, rhythmic sound of his breathing had been my ultimate comfort. Now it made my skin crawl. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to push him out of the bed. At 3 in the morning, I finally slipped out from under the heavy-down comforter. I crept downstairs to my home office, silently locking the solid oak door behind me. I opened my laptop, turning the screen brightness all the way down so the glow wouldn't seep under the door. I bypassed our personal checking accounts entirely. I went straight into the deep, complex architecture of Vanguard Properties' corporate financials. I pulled up the routing numbers Chloe had mentioned through the guest house window. It took me 4 grueling hours of forensic tracing. My eyes burned and my neck ached, but I didn't stop. The $12,000 in missing ATM cash was just the appetizer. It was pocket change meant to distract me from the real theft. Marcus had been systematically setting up dummy LLCs registered in Delaware. He was funneling massive amounts of money from our joint investment accounts into these offshore holding companies. He masked the transfers, brilliantly labeling them as legitimate contractor payouts and consulting fees for Vanguard. He was using his extensive corporate law background to legally bleed my company dry. The next morning, the sun rose demanding I put on the most difficult performance of my life. I walked into the kitchen at 7. Marcus was at the espresso machine looking sharp and handsome in a navy suit. Chloe was perched on the edge of a bar stool wearing a pair of my expensive silk pajama shorts. "Morning, Maya," Marcus said, handing me a small cup of coffee. He kissed my forehead. The touch of his lips felt like a physical burn. "You look exhausted," Chloe chimed in, stirring her tea with an obnoxious clinking sound. She offered me a sweet, pitying smile. "You really shouldn't push yourself so hard at those dusty construction sites. It ages you." I gripped the edge of the marble countertop. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the scalding espresso directly into her smug, ungrateful face. Instead, I forced my shoulders to relax. I let out a heavy, convincing sigh. "You are right, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly pitched to sound defeated and tired. "It is just a stressful week. I am lucky to have you here to help manage the house." Marcus beamed, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He patted my shoulder, telling me I was finally seeing reason. The gaslighting was so effortless, so practiced, that it terrified me. I swallowed the thick, bitter bile rising in my throat. I smiled at my husband over my coffee cup, knowing I was trapped in a daily nightmare. I had to endure this torture smiling at my betrayers until my legal strategy was bulletproof. Later that afternoon, Marcus left for a golf meeting with his firm partners. Chloe announced she was getting a manicure. The moment I heard her car pull out of the driveway, I walked directly into Marcus's home office. I didn't tear the room apart like a frantic, heartbroken wife. I searched it like a forensic auditor. I checked the false bottoms of his desk drawers. I went through the pockets of his winter coats. I examined the hollow spaces behind his massive bookshelf. Then I pulled his heavy leather armchair away from the desk. I ran my hand flat along the underside of the wooden seat frame. My fingers brushed against a thick strip of duct tape. My pulse pounded in my ears as I peeled the tape back. A sleek black burner phone fell heavily into the palm of my hand. I carried it to his desk and pressed the power button. The screen lit up, demanding a 4-digit passcode. I took a slow breath. I tried our wedding anniversary. Incorrect. I tried his birthday. Incorrect. Then I remembered the sheer arrogance of the man I was dealing with. I typed in the year Chloe was born. The phone unlocked instantly. There were no contacts saved in the address book. There was only a single endless text thread with a random out-of-state area code. I scrolled up to messages from 3 months ago. The words glowing on the small screen were physically sickening. "The old floor scrubber is working late again tonight," Marcus had written. "Good," Chloe replied. "More time for us in the guest suite. Did you get the Vanguard transfer done?" "Yes, she has absolutely no idea. She is too busy playing boss to look at the actual ledgers. We will have enough to file the divorce papers by December." I read months of their digital cruelty. I read messages mocking my clothes, my laugh, and the calluses on my hands. I read graphic, passionate details of what they did in my home while I was out building our wealth. They didn't just want my money. They deeply, actively despised me. My profound, agonizing heartbreak finally shattered completely. The fragments of the woman who loved Marcus dissolved into dust. In its place, a cold, absolute calculating rage took root deep in my chest. I took out my own phone and began taking high-definition photographs of every single text message, every date, and every timestamp. I wasn't just gathering evidence for a divorce. I was gathering an arsenal. I was going to legally and financially annihilate them. I put the burner phone exactly back where I found it, taping it securely under the chair. I walked out of his office, leaving no trace of my presence. For the next 3 days, I lived a double life. By day, I was the overworked, gullible wife nodding along to Marcus's lies and ignoring Chloe's disrespect. But late at night, locked in my office, I was a predator tracking my prey. I focused all my energy on cracking the firewall of the largest Delaware LLC. Marcus had layered the transfers through 3 different dummy corporations to hide the final destination. But he wasn't an accountant. He had left a digital paper trail in the metadata of the wire transfers. On Thursday night, the house was dead silent. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 2. I sat in the dark glow of my laptop screen, my eyes locked on the final routing number. I ran it through a secure financial database Vanguard used for background checks. The firewall finally broke. The ultimate destination of the funneled money loaded onto my screen. It wasn't a corporate holding account. It wasn't an offshore trust. I stared at the official bank charter document, all the breath leaving my lungs in a sharp rush. It was a private, high-yield joint checking account at a premium bank across town. And sitting right there, listed clearly in black and white as equal co-owners, were Marcus Sterling and Chloe Adams, funded entirely by my hard-earned money. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop until my eyes watered. Seeing my life savings sitting in a joint checking account under their names was a physical blow. The numbers blurred together, a digital monument to my husband's absolute treachery. The cold, calculating rage that had taken root in my chest the night before hardened into solid steel. I carefully closed the laptop and sat in the profound silence of my home office. I was ready to fight. I was ready to meticulously tear down the financial traps he had set. But I had severely underestimated Marcus's timeline. He wasn't waiting for the holidays to destroy me. He was moving in for the kill right now. The preemptive strike came 2 days later on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning. I was in the kitchen pouring my second cup of coffee. Marcus had left early, claiming he had an emergency meeting with a senior partner. Chloe was predictably asleep in the guest house. The doorbell rang, a sharp, jarring sound that echoed through the quiet foyer. I opened the heavy mahogany door to find a man in a rumpled suit standing on my porch. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a polite greeting. He simply thrust a thick manila envelope into my hands. "Maya Sterling," he asked automatically. "Yes," I replied, confusion knitting my brows. "You have been served," he said flatly, turning on his heel and walking briskly down the driveway. I stood in the open doorway, the morning breeze chilling my skin. I tore open the heavy envelope, pulling out a stack of dense legal documents. The bold black header on the first page seemed to jump off the paper, mocking me. Petition for dissolution of marriage. My breath caught in my throat. I knew the divorce was coming. I had read their sickening text messages outlining the plan. But seeing it officially filed, seeing my marriage reduced to a stack of sterile court papers, sent a fresh wave of shock crashing over me. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the staggering demands Marcus had outlined with his aggressive legal team. He wanted exclusive ownership of the house. He was demanding a massive monthly alimony payment to maintain his accustomed standard of living. But the most sickening demand was buried on page 4. Marcus was petitioning for a full 50% of Vanguard properties. His legal justification was infuriating. He claimed that his career as a corporate attorney was the primary financial engine of our marriage. He had the sheer audacity to state in a sworn legal document that my multi-million-dollar real estate firm was merely a hobby business I started while I cleaned floors. I gripped the papers so tightly the edges crumpled in my fists. He was trying to erase my 15 years of grueling labor. He was trying to rewrite history, painting himself as the wealthy provider and me as the lucky beneficiary. He wanted the court to believe that the woman who scrubbed commercial toilets at 3 a.m. to pay his law school tuition was nothing more than a dependent. The sheer arrogance was blinding. He had built his pristine legal career entirely on the foundation of my exhausted, aching back, and now he was stepping on my neck to claim the entire castle. Before I could fully process the sheer scale of his demands, my cell phone began ringing frantically on the kitchen counter. It was Sarah, my head of human resources at Vanguard. Maya, we have a massive problem. Sarah's voice trembled with panic. I just tried to process the bi-weekly payroll. The bank rejected the transfer. Our primary operating accounts are completely frozen. The blood drained from my face. That is impossible, Sarah. We have over $1 million in liquid capital in that account. I just spoke to the branch manager. She continued, her voice rising in pitch. He said a temporary restraining order was placed on the accounts early this morning. It is linked to a pending domestic litigation filing. Maya, our cleaning crews and contractors expect their checks tomorrow. We are paralyzed. Marcus had used his elite legal connections and a dirty loophole to freeze my business assets the exact moment I was served. He knew Vanguard's operational structure intimately. He knew that paralyzing the payroll would cause instant chaos and force me into immediate submission. He was cutting off my oxygen. Tell the staff there is a minor banking error and it will be resolved within 48 hours. I instructed Sarah, forcing a calm authority into my voice that I absolutely did not feel. I will handle this. I hung up the phone, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I was legally and financially cornered in my own kitchen. The walls of the beautiful house I had paid for suddenly felt like a prison closing in on me. Bad news. I spun around. Chloe was standing in the kitchen archway. The respectful, timid maid persona was completely gone. The mask was not just slipping, it had been gleefully thrown away. She was wearing my expensive silk morning robe. She sauntered over to the massive refrigerator and poured herself a glass of my imported orange juice. She leaned against the marble island, crossing her ankles casually. "You look a little stressed, Maya," she sneered, taking a slow sip of the juice. "I guess pretending to be a big important boss finally caught up with you." I stared at her, the sheer disrespect rolling off her in waves. "This is my house, Chloe. You are an employee. Go to the guest suite and pack your things." Chloe laughed. It was a high, cruel sound that echoed off the custom cabinets. "I do not think so. Marcus said I do not have to listen to you anymore. In fact, he said this house is going to be ours very soon. You are the one who needs to start packing." She set the glass down hard on the marble counter, stepping into my personal space. The scent of my stolen perfume was suffocating. "You really thought you were something special, didn't you?" Chloe taunted, her eyes flashing with malicious delight. "You thought throwing some money around made you equal to a man like Marcus. He always hated your rough hands. He hated how you smelled like construction dust. He deserves a real woman, not a tired workhorse." Every instinct in my body screamed to strike her. I wanted to wipe that smug, entitled smile off her face. But the cold, calculating voice of the CEO inside me held me back. Hitting her would only give Marcus the ammunition he needed to secure a permanent restraining order and force me out of the house immediately. I had to endure this humiliation. I had to swallow the poison to survive the war. I didn't say a single word. I turned my back on her and walked straight out of the kitchen, locking myself in my home office. The psychological toll was immense. I sat at my desk, burying my face in my trembling hands. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the terrifying weight of despair pulling me under. Marcus had outmaneuvered me. He had weaponized the legal system against me, frozen the lifeblood of my company, and unleashed his mistress to torture me in my own sanctuary. I was watching my life's work dissolve before my eyes. The commercial empire I had built from a single mop bucket, the generational wealth I had painstakingly accumulated, was being snatched away by the man I had trusted implicitly. The betrayal cut deeper than the financial ruin. He knew how much Vanguard meant to me. He knew it was my identity, my pride, and my independence. And he was trying to execute a flawless surgical strike to take it all. I needed a lifeline. I needed a strategy that Marcus could not anticipate. I frantically started pulling up the secondary hidden trust ledgers I had accessed days ago. I was trying to map out a path to route emergency funds to my payroll department without triggering Marcus's legal tripwires. The numbers swam before my exhausted eyes. The pressure to save my employees and my empire was suffocating. Just as I finally found a potential back channel to wire the payroll funds, my cell phone rang again. It was David, my lead forensic accountant. I grabbed the phone instantly, desperate for any good news. "David, tell me you found a way to bypass the restraining order on the primary accounts," I said, my voice tight with anxiety. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "Maya," David said, his voice dropping to a grave, urgent whisper, "the frozen operating accounts are the least of your problems." My stomach plummeted. "What do you mean? What else has he done?" "I just got an alert from the state corporate registry," David explained, the panic evident in his usually steady voice. "Marcus isn't just trying to take half your business in the divorce. He has escalated." I gripped the edge of my heavy oak desk. "He cannot do that. He does not have executive authority over Vanguard. I am the sole managing member." "He does now," David replied grimly. "Maya, he just filed a comprehensive document with the state board. It grants him complete executive control over all Vanguard assets, contracts, and banking. He has initiated a full hostile takeover of your LLC, and he did it using a forged power of attorney." The line went dead, leaving me in a suffocating, absolute silence. A forged power of attorney. Marcus had not just locked the doors to my company, he had effectively stolen the keys to my entire kingdom. I lowered the phone, my hand trembling so violently I could barely set the device on the cheap laminate nightstand. I stared at the blank screen, feeling the cold reality of my situation wrapping around my throat like a vice. I was sitting on the edge of a lumpy, sagging mattress in a roadside motel on the bleak outskirts of the city. I had packed a single suitcase and left my beautiful house 2 days ago. Living under the same roof as Marcus and his gloating mistress had become a psychological torture I could no longer endure. I needed space to breathe, to think, to survive the wreckage of my life. The motel room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial pine cleaner. The neon vacancy sign outside flickered incessantly, casting harsh, bloody shadows across the peeling floral wallpaper. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms tightly around my legs. I had built Vanguard properties with my own blood, sweat, and tears. I had scrubbed public toilets until my knuckles cracked and bled to fund the very law degree he was now weaponizing against me. He genuinely thought he had outsmarted me. He believed that the blue-collar girl with the mop bucket lacked the sophisticated intellect to protect her own corporate empire. But as the initial shock of the hostile takeover washed over me, a distant, quiet memory broke through the rising panic. I closed my eyes and pictured my late grandfather. He was a man of few words, a retired steelworker who had survived the harshest economic storms of his generation. I vividly remembered sitting with him on his dilapidated wooden front porch the day I closed on my very first commercial building. He had smiled, his eyes crinkling with pride, and handed me a small, heavy brass key. "Never put all your harvest in one barn, Maya." His deep, gravelly voice echoed clearly in my memory. "When you build something of true value in this world, there will always be someone waiting to take it. You make sure you have a vault they cannot even see." My eyes snapped open in the dim motel room. My heart gave a sudden, violent lurch against my ribs. Marcus had found the primary operating accounts. He had found the visible corporate LLCs. He had even found the forged deed to the house. But his sheer arrogance had blinded him to the reality that I was playing a game several levels above his comprehension. I grabbed my trench coat and rushed out into the damp, freezing morning air. I drove across town, deliberately bypassing the glittering high-rise financial district entirely. Instead, I parked in front of a small, unassuming community bank nestled in a quiet, older neighborhood. It was exactly the kind of modest institution elite corporate lawyers like Marcus completely ignored. I walked inside, presenting my identification and the small brass key I had kept hidden on a silver chain around my neck for 7 long years. The elderly bank manager offered a polite nod, led me into the silent, secure vault room, and left me completely alone. I inserted the key and opened the heavy metal box. Inside lay a thick leather-bound financial ledger and a stack of crisp, densely worded legal documents. I ran my trembling fingers over the heavy parchment. These were the irrevocable trust documents. Years ago, before Vanguard's profits truly exploded, I had quietly transferred the absolute ownership of my core commercial assets and the true unassailable deed to my home into an ironclad blind trust. I was the sole beneficiary, but legally the trust was a completely independent fortress. Marital property laws could not touch it. A sudden divorce filing could not split it, and a forged power of attorney could not breach its walls. Marcus thought he had executed a brilliant hostile takeover of my entire empire. In reality, he had just aggressively conquered an empty, worthless shell. The real wealth, the beating lifeblood of my companies, was sitting right here in my hands, completely immune to his legal traps. A slow, dangerous heat spread through my chest, melting away the freezing despair. It was the spark of hope I desperately needed. I was not a helpless victim. I was heavily armed. I just needed to bide my time, play the role of the defeated, broken wife, and let Marcus dig his own grave so deep he would never be able to climb out. I carefully returned the vital documents to the box, ensuring they were perfectly safe. I walked out of the bank with a renewed lethal focus. My tears were entirely gone. They were replaced by a cold, calculating determination that sharpened my every thought. When I got back to my car, my cell phone vibrated violently in the cup holder. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my guard instantly up before pressing the answer button. "Hello, Maya." The voice on the other end was male, young, and laced with thick, unmistakable anxiety. "Please do not hang up on me. My name is David. I was a senior paralegal at your husband's firm until yesterday morning." My grip tightened around the leather steering wheel. "Why are you calling me David?" "Because Marcus fired me," David said, his voice dropping to a harsh, frantic whisper, as if he were terrified of being overheard. "I noticed some massive irregularities in his corporate billing accounts. When I asked questions about offshore transfers linked to Vanguard properties, he terminated me on the spot. He threatened to completely ruin my career if I spoke a word to anyone." I stopped breathing. The morning rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windshield in the quiet neighborhood. "I know what he is doing to you, Maya," David continued, the anxiety in his voice giving way to a quiet, simmering anger. "I know about the forged documents. I know about the dummy corporations, and I am not going to let him destroy my career to cover up his financial crimes." "What exactly do you have?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "Absolutely everything," David replied instantly. "I made copies of his private server before security escorted me out of the building. I have the digital blueprints of every single offshore account he set up. I have the hidden wire transfer receipts. I have enough undeniable evidence to not just get your company back, but to get him stripped of his law license and put in federal prison." We agreed to meet immediately at a crowded, noisy diner 2 towns over. When I arrived, David was already sitting in a back corner booth, nervously nursing a cup of black coffee. He looked terrified, exhausted, but resolute. He slid a small silver flash drive across the sticky Formica table. "It is all heavily encrypted, but I wrote the master passwords on that napkin," David said, glancing anxiously toward the diner entrance. "He has been planning this financial execution for over a year, Maya. The level of premeditation is absolutely sickening." I took the flash drive, feeling the cool metal against my palm. This tiny piece of technology was the weapon that would utterly decimate my husband's life. "Why are you taking this massive risk for me, David?" "Because I watched you come into the office for years, bringing him lunch, supporting his career while he treated you like an inconvenience," David said, shaking his head in deep disgust. "He used to mock you behind your back. He called you uneducated. He laughed with his partners about spending your money. Nobody deserves what he is putting you through. Nobody." I drove back to my dismal motel room, the flash drive burning a hole in my pocket. I locked the deadbolt, pulled the heavy blackout curtains tightly shut, and opened my laptop. I inserted the drive, typed in David's passwords, and watched as the dark, twisted architecture of my husband's betrayal loaded onto the screen. David had not exaggerated in the slightest. The files were an absolute goldmine of criminal activity. There were detailed ledgers, forged signatures, and explicit emails between Marcus and his partners discussing the absolute best legal loopholes to secretly drain a spouse's corporate assets. But as I dug deeper into the digital files, meticulously searching for the specific routing numbers tied to Chloe's joint account, I stumbled across a hidden encrypted subfolder. It was labeled simply with a string of numbers. I clicked on it. A series of scanned background checks and heavily redacted police reports suddenly appeared. I frowned, leaning closer to the glowing screen. I opened the first file. It was a police mugshot. The young woman staring back at me had dark brown hair instead of blonde, and she looked a few years younger, but the arrogant, defiant sneer resting on her lips was absolutely unmistakable. It was Chloe. I quickly scanned the attached police report. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. The official document outlined a sophisticated wire fraud operation in Chicago 3 years ago. A young woman had successfully infiltrated the home of a wealthy female executive by posing as a struggling student desperate for domestic work. Once inside the home, she had systematically gained access to the family's financial routing numbers, working with an outside legal partner to drain their investment portfolios before vanishing without a single trace. I clicked and opened the next file. It was another police report, this time from Miami. The exact same operation. A different wealthy female victim, the exact same suspect. The air completely vanished from the tiny motel room. The devastating truth hit me with the incredible force of a physical blow. Marcus had not just fallen into a cliché, pathetic affair with a younger woman. He had not hired a maid and simply happened to sleep with her. He had deliberately sought out and recruited a professional criminal. Chloe was not just a mistress. She was a highly skilled, experienced predator. She was an active accomplice in a massive coordinated fraud ring that specifically targeted successful independent women. And my own husband had intentionally brought her into my sanctuary to help orchestrate my absolute ruin. I sat in the dim, stale air of the motel room, the harsh glow of the laptop illuminating the police mugshots on my screen. Marcus hadn't just broken his marriage vows. He had hired a financial assassin. Chloe was a weapon carefully selected and intentionally brought into my home. The sheer sociopathic calculation of it all threatened to drag me into a black hole of panic. But the woman who used to scrub corporate floors at 3 in the morning didn't know how to panic. She only knew how to work. I closed the files and picked up my burner phone. I called David. I told him we needed a forensic accountant, someone absolutely ruthless, who didn't ask polite questions. By noon the next day, we were sitting in a windowless rented office space on the industrial side of town. Elias was a former IRS investigator with cold, assessing eyes and a mind like a steel trap. He didn't offer sympathy when I laid out the extent of the betrayal. He just cracked his knuckles and plugged David's flash drive into his encrypted server. For the next 2 weeks, that dusty, windowless room became my war room. We meticulously traced every single stolen dollar. Marcus had been busy. He had set up a complex web of dummy corporations, moving my capital through digital mazes to wash it clean. But Elias was better. He tracked the digital fingerprints Marcus had carelessly left behind, mapping out the entire architecture of his fraud. While Elias hunted the stolen money, I initiated a strategy of invisible rebuilding. My primary operating accounts were still frozen by Marcus's legal maneuvering, leaving Vanguard properties temporarily paralyzed. I needed to ensure my future revenue didn't fall into his lap. Working through burner laptops and encrypted emails, I quietly formed a new highly secure corporate entity. I named it Apex Holdings. I reached out to my three largest upcoming commercial clients. These were massive multi-million-dollar contracts that Marcus knew were in the pipeline. I met with the property managers privately, leveraging years of absolute trust. I explained there was an internal restructuring happening and rerouted their upcoming contracts directly into Apex Holdings. Marcus couldn't touch a single dime of that new revenue. He didn't even know the company existed. The exhaustion was absolute. I was sleeping 3 hours a night on a sagging motel mattress, fueled entirely by black coffee and cold burning rage. But the hardest part wasn't the grueling work. The hardest part was the performance I had to give in the daylight. To keep Marcus completely off my scent, I had to play the role of the defeated, broken wife. I had to let him believe his hostile takeover was a total success. Our first preliminary mediation session took place in a pristine glass-walled conference room at his lawyer's downtown firm. I walked in wearing a slightly wrinkled blouse, my hair pulled back into a messy knot. I deliberately left my makeup minimal, allowing the dark circles under my eyes to show. I needed to look like a woman who had lost everything. Marcus arrived looking like a king. He wore a brand new custom-tailored Italian suit. A heavy platinum Rolex gleamed on his wrist. It was a watch I knew for a fact he hadn't owned a week ago. He sat across from me, practically vibrating with smug superiority. His lawyer slid the preliminary settlement demands across the polished table. They were completely insulting. They offered me a fraction of my own company and a meager buyout for the house I had paid for. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, watching me with a look of supreme pity. "It's a generous offer, Maya," Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You should take it. The accounts are frozen. The LLC is under my control. If we drag this out in court, you won't have the resources to fight me. I don't want to see you end up bankrupt." It took every ounce of discipline I possessed not to laugh in his face. I didn't want to flip the table. I wanted to reach across it and wrap my hands around his tailored collar. I wanted to scream that I held the irrevocable trust documents that rendered his entire hostile takeover legally void. I wanted to tell him I had the flash drive that was going to put him in a federal penitentiary. Instead, I lowered my head. I let my shoulders slump. I forced my voice to tremble just enough to sound thoroughly defeated. "I just need some time to look it over, Marcus," I whispered, staring down at my hands. "Please. I don't have anywhere else to go." He smiled. It was a small, cruel, victorious smile. He genuinely believed he had broken the workhorse. He thought he had successfully stolen the empire. "Take the weekend," he said magnanimously, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "But my patience isn't infinite." I walked out of that building feeling physically sick, but my performance had worked perfectly. His hubris was his ultimate blind spot. He was so intoxicated by his false victory that he became incredibly reckless. Over the next week, David and I watched the financial alerts roll in. Marcus and Chloe were spending the money they believed they had stolen at a sickening pace. They bought matching luxury SUVs, paying cash directly from the compromised joint accounts. They booked first-class tickets for an upcoming trip to Paris. They were throwing my life savings around like confetti. They were completely unaware that Elias was documenting every single fraudulent transaction, building an airtight portfolio for the federal prosecutor. I watched the numbers drain from the screen, reminding myself that every dollar they spent was another nail in their legal coffin. The emotional toll of living this double life began to weigh heavily on me. I missed my beautiful home. I missed the sanctuary I had designed with my own two hands. Knowing that Chloe was walking across my Persian rugs, sleeping in my bed, and playing house with my husband felt like a constant dull ache in my chest. I had to keep reminding myself that the endgame was coming. I was forging the chains that would lock them both away. Late one Thursday night, the rain was coming down hard, drumming against the thin window of the rented office space. David, Elias, and I were hunched over our respective monitors. We were digging through the deepest layers of Marcus's offshore accounts, trying to find the final resting place for a massive block of Vanguard funds that had seemingly vanished into thin air. Elias had been staring at lines of code for 6 straight hours. Suddenly, he stopped typing. He leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowing as he highlighted a specific string of transactions. "I found the missing block of capital," Elias said, his voice unusually quiet. "But it didn't go to an offshore account. It was routed back onshore into a private wealth management trust right here in the state." I moved behind his chair, staring at the glowing screen. "Who holds the trust?" David pulled up a parallel database, his fingers flying across the keyboard to cross-reference the tax identification numbers. The room was dead silent, except for the rapid clicking of the keys. We had assumed Marcus and Chloe were operating alone, a greedy lawyer and his professional grifter mistress. "Maya," David said, looking up from his screen. He looked physically ill. "The trust isn't in Marcus's name. It's not in Chloe's name either." He turned the monitor toward me. I stared at the official bank charter document tracing the lines of the irrevocable trust, holding over $400,000 of my stolen money. The breath hitched painfully in my throat. The betrayal wasn't just a husband and a mistress. It was a coordinated, deeply personal execution. Sitting right there on the primary beneficiary line, listed as the sole proprietor of the hidden account, was Eleanor Sterling, my mother-in-law. The woman who had eaten dinners at my table and sneered at my calloused hands hadn't just turned a blind eye to the affair. She had actively, willingly helped her son hide the assets he stole from me. The name on the screen blurred as all the air rushed out of the tiny, windowless office. Eleanor Sterling, my mother-in-law. The woman who had sneered at my worn work boots, who had relentlessly criticized my lack of pedigree, was listed as the primary beneficiary of the hidden trust. I gripped the edge of the cheap folding table so hard my knuckles turned white, the flimsy plastic digging into my skin. The betrayal was no longer just a husband sneaking around with a younger woman. It was a coordinated, deeply personal execution. "He didn't just cheat on you, Maya," David whispered, his eyes wide with horror as he scrolled through the connecting bank documents. "He recruited her." It hit me like a physical blow to the chest, stealing my breath. Chloe wasn't an accidental mistress he met at a downtown bar. She was a professional grifter, carefully selected and intentionally planted inside my home. Marcus had brought a financial assassin into my sanctuary, and his mother had gladly held the getaway car. They had looked at my 15 years of grueling, bone-breaking labor, looked at the calluses on my hands, and decided they were simply entitled to take the harvest. I stood up, pushing my chair back so violently it crashed to the concrete floor. I couldn't breathe. I paced the length of the room, my hands pulling at my hair. Every Sunday dinner suddenly played backwards in my mind. Every forced smile across the roasted chicken. Every time Eleanor had praised Chloe's youthful energy right in front of my face. They hadn't just been stealing from me. They had been laughing at me. "Maya, breathe!" Elias said, his voice steady and grounding, cutting through the roaring in my ears. "Don't let them break your focus now. We have them." He was right. I stopped pacing, pressing my palms against the cold cinder-block wall, and forced air into my burning lungs. The heartbreak was trying to drown me, begging me to collapse into a puddle of tears. But I refused to let it pull me under. The naive woman who had loved Marcus Sterling unconditionally was dead. In her place stood the CEO of Vanguard Properties, and she was ready for war. For the next 3 days, I barely slept. David, Elias, and I worked around the clock in that dusty office, fueled by bitter black coffee and absolute resolve. We were compiling the most devastating legal arsenal imaginable. We didn't just have suspicions or circumstantial grievances. We had undeniable court-ready proof. Elias finalized the forensic audit, creating a crystal-clear, heavily documented map of every single stolen dollar. We had the routing numbers, the forged signatures on the LLC shell companies, and the offshore wire transfers. We had the exact paper trail linking Chloe's previous fraud victims in Chicago and Miami to the exact same methods Marcus was using to bleed my accounts. David compiled the metadata from Marcus's hidden burner phone. We printed out hundreds of pages of sickening text messages. There was a digital time-stamped record of adultery conspiracy to commit wire fraud and grand larceny. It was an airtight federal-level criminal case wrapped in a neat, undeniable bow. I sat in my dim motel room late on a Tuesday night, listening to the buzzing neon sign outside my window, staring at the thick binders stacked on my sagging bed. They contained the absolute destruction of my husband's life and career. I had the power to spring the trap right then and there. Every instinct inside me, every ounce of wounded pride screamed to call the police to smash their smug faces with the truth, to reclaim my beautiful home immediately. The emotional restraint required to hold back was absolute agony. I had to bite my tongue until it tasted like copper. I had to keep playing the desperate, defeated wife during daylight hours, allowing Marcus to revel in his false sense of victory. If I moved too early, if my anger caused me to miss a single legal tripwire, Marcus could use his elite firm connections to slither away. I needed him completely exposed, standing fully in the open before I pulled the trigger. Just as I was sealing the final affidavit for my massive countersuit, my phone chimed loudly in the quiet room. It was an email from Marcus's legal team. I opened it expecting another condescending settlement offer. Instead, it was a formal, aggressively worded eviction notice. The legal jargon was thick, sterile, and merciless. Marcus was demanding I formally surrender the property and vacate the premises entirely within 48 hours. He claimed my continued presence, even my belongings left boxed in the guest closets, was causing him undue emotional distress. But the absolute height of his hubris was tucked into the final paragraph. He was requiring me to attend a final mandatory walkthrough of the house on Friday evening. He wanted me to hand over my keys in person. He wanted to look me in the eye as he officially claimed his prize and kicked me to the curb. A dark, lethal calm settled over me. The tears I had shed over this man dried up completely. He wanted a final walkthrough. He wanted an audience for his triumph. I replied to the email with a single submissive sentence. I understand and I will be there. The next 48 hours moved with agonizing slowness. I finalized the transfer of my new high-value client contracts into Apex Holdings, effectively securing my future revenue. I spoke with my lead attorney, coordinating the exact timing for filing the irrevocable trust documents that would legally obliterate Marcus's forged power of attorney. I even made a quiet, highly confidential phone call to a federal contact David had at the authorities. When Friday evening finally arrived, I didn't dress like a broken woman. I purged the motel smell from my skin and put on my favorite tailored business suit, the dark charcoal one I wore to close my biggest commercial deals. I slipped my feet into sharp, polished black heels. I applied my makeup with meticulous precision, masking the profound exhaustion of the past month behind a flawless professional armor. I packed the heavy binders of evidence into a sleek leather briefcase. The encrypted flash drive with the federal wire fraud proof was tucked safely into my interior jacket pocket. I was ready to burn his empire to the ground. The drive to my house took exactly 22 minutes. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the familiar manicured lawns and tree-lined streets of my neighborhood. My heart hammered against my ribs, a steady, relentless drumbeat of anticipation and pure rage. This was the house I had scrubbed public toilets to pay for. This was the sanctuary I had built from nothing. I turned onto my street and slowed my car. As my beautiful custom-built home came into view, my brow furrowed in deep confusion. The long paved driveway wasn't empty. It was completely packed. There were at least a dozen cars lined up along the curb. I recognized Marcus's luxury sports car, Chloe's brand new SUV, and several expensive sedans that belonged to my husband's arrogant relatives. The front windows of the house were blazing with light illuminating the dusk. I parked my car silently across the street, gripping the leather steering wheel until my hands ached. I rolled down my window. The crisp evening air carried the unmistakable sound of loud, upbeat music and booming laughter drifting from my open patio doors. This wasn't a sterile legal walkthrough. I stepped out of my car, my heels clicking softly and rhythmically against the asphalt. I walked up my own driveway, moving past the luxury vehicles my stolen money had likely paid for. The heavy mahogany front door was slightly ajar, inviting the evening breeze inside. I pushed it open and stepped into the grand marble foyer. The house was filled to the brim with people. Waiters I hadn't hired were circulating the room with silver trays of expensive champagne. Massive, elaborate bouquets of white roses were arranged on every available surface. And standing in the center of my living room directly under the glittering crystal chandelier I had meticulously picked out was Marcus. He was wearing a tailored tuxedo, grinning from ear to ear. Chloe was clinging tightly to his arm, dressed in a stunning floor-length white evening gown. She was holding up her left hand, showing off a massive glittering diamond ring to a circle of Marcus's cheering relatives. They weren't just kicking me out. They were throwing a celebratory engagement party with Marcus's entire family. The crystal chandelier cast a warm, glittering light over the engagement party, happening right in the center of my living room. I stood frozen in the shadows of the grand marble foyer, completely unnoticed by the sea of people celebrating my impending ruin. Waiters I had certainly not hired were circulating the room with silver trays of expensive champagne. Massive, elaborate bouquets of white roses were arranged on every available surface, filling the air with a heavy, sickeningly sweet floral scent. And standing directly under the chandelier I had meticulously picked out was Marcus. He was wearing a tailored tuxedo, grinning from ear to ear, projecting the aura of a man who had conquered the world. Chloe was clinging tightly to his arm, dressed in a stunning floor-length white evening gown. She held up her left hand, showing off a massive, glittering diamond ring to a circle of Marcus's cheering relatives. They weren't just kicking me out of my own property. They were throwing a celebratory engagement party, basking in the wealth they believed they had successfully stolen from me. I pressed my back against the cool marble wall of the entryway, letting the sheer audacity of the moment wash over me. A week ago, this sight would have shattered me into a million unrecognizable pieces. I would have collapsed on this floor, sobbing, begging for an explanation. But the woman who loved Marcus Sterling was dead. I watched them toast to their brilliant future, a slow, dangerous smile creeping across my own face. They genuinely believed they had won this war. They had absolutely no idea that while they were busy ordering expensive roses and hiring caterers, I had spent the last 48 hours dismantling their entire universe. The chessboard had already flipped. They were just too blind to see it. My mind drifted back to the agonizing performance I had maintained all week. To keep Marcus completely off my scent, I had to play the role of the defeated, desperate wife flawlessly. I had replied to his aggressive eviction demands, with emails dripping with complete submission. I begged him for extra time. I asked him where I was supposed to go. I projected an aura of total surrender, ensuring his massive ego remained inflated and his guard remained completely down. He was so intoxicated by his false victory that he didn't realize I was legally wrapping a noose around his career. Just 12 hours ago, my powerhouse legal team had walked into the county courthouse. We hadn't just filed a standard response to Marcus's ridiculous divorce petition. We had filed the irrevocable trust documents under a strict, impenetrable judicial seal. With a single stroke of a judge's pen, my primary operating accounts at Vanguard Properties had been completely unfrozen. I didn't stop there. Using the very same ironclad trust provisions that Marcus's hubris had blinded him to, I preemptively locked him out of my entire financial ecosystem. His forged power of attorney was now legally worthless paper. He was currently standing in my house drinking champagne paid for, with my money completely unaware that his access to my companies, my bank accounts, and my assets had been surgically and permanently severed. But the financial lockout was only the beginning of my counterattack. Earlier that afternoon, before putting on my makeup, I sat in a sterile, brightly lit conference room at the local police precinct. My hands didn't shake as I slid David's encrypted flash drive and Elias's massive forensic accounting reports across the metal table to a federal investigator. We meticulously outlined the offshore wire transfers, the dummy LLCs, and Chloe's undeniable history as a professional fraudster. The authorities were no longer just a distant, abstract threat. They were a coordinated strike team. They were fully briefed, heavily armed with airtight evidence, and sitting on standby, waiting for my signal to move in. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling myself back to the present moment in the foyer. The noise of the party was deafening. Marcus laughed loudly at a joke his uncle made, kissing Chloe's cheek. My rage was no longer a wild, uncontrollable fire. It was focused, contained, and absolutely lethal. I was no longer the heartbroken wife scrambling for survival. I was the CEO reclaiming her stolen territory. But as I watched them celebrate my demise, I realized my small designer clutch wasn't going to be enough for what I had planned. I needed my armor and I needed my weapons. I had deliberately left my heavy leather briefcase locked in the trunk of my car across the street. Inside that briefcase were the physical binders of evidence. Hundreds of pages of their sickening text messages, the routing numbers to Eleanor's hidden trust, and the police mugshots from Chloe's previous scams in Chicago and Miami. I didn't just want to tell them they were going to prison. I wanted to drop the undeniable physical proof right onto their expensive catered appetizers. I took a silent, careful step backward. The booming laughter and loud music easily masked the sound of the heavy mahogany front door clicking shut as I slipped back outside into the night. The evening air was crisp and cool, a sharp, refreshing contrast to the suffocating heat of the betrayal inside. I walked down the long paved driveway, my heels clicking softly against the concrete. I moved past the long line of luxury vehicles that my stolen money had likely financed, crossing the quiet tree-lined street to where I had parked my sedan in the deep shadows. I popped the trunk, the mechanical click sounding incredibly loud in the quiet, manicured neighborhood. As I reached inside, I caught my reflection in the polished dark glass of the rear window. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like an executioner. I had spent the previous night meticulously preparing for this exact moment. I was wearing my most powerful, elegant charcoal business suit, the one I reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless knot. My posture was straight, my shoulders squared, forged from 15 years of carrying the immense weight of an empire. I reached into the dark trunk and grabbed the briefcase by its thick brass handle. It was incredibly heavy, filled with the documents that would utterly destroy my husband's life. I pulled it out, letting the weight ground me. My pulse was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat in my ears. I felt a strange, profound sense of peace wash over me. This was it. The impending confrontation would undoubtedly be the most defining moment of my entire life. I was about to walk back into my beautiful home, look my arrogant husband in the eye, and unleash absolute uncompromising devastation upon him and his entire deceitful family. I closed the trunk with a soft thud and locked the car. I turned back toward the brightly lit house, gripping the briefcase handle until my knuckles turned white. Just as I took my first determined step off the curb, the low, smooth purr of a luxury engine broke the silence of the street. A sleek black town car slowly pulled up my driveway, coming to a smooth stop directly near the front porch. The driver quickly got out and hurried around to open the rear passenger door. I froze, stepping instinctively back into the shadows of my car to avoid being seen in the headlights. A pair of expensive, strappy heels touched the pavement. Then Eleanor emerged. Marcus's mother stepped out of the vehicle, projecting an air of absolute aristocratic superiority. She was wearing a stunning dark emerald evening gown, her hair perfectly coiffed for the celebration. She looked incredibly smug, undoubtedly ready to toast to her son's new wealthy life. But it wasn't her arrogant expression or her expensive gown that made my breath catch sharply in my throat. As she turned toward the warm glow of the porch light, the bright illumination caught the jewelry resting heavily against her collarbone. My stomach plummeted into an endless freezing void, and my grip on the briefcase tightened painfully. Hanging proudly around her neck, glittering with undeniable, sickening brilliance, was the exact diamond necklace Marcus had bought with $12,000 of my stolen funds. The diamonds resting against Eleanor's collarbone caught the porch light, shooting tiny, arrogant rainbows across the concrete. I recognized the setting instantly. It was the exact $12,000 piece of jewelry Marcus had bought with stolen Vanguard funds. The receipt I had found in his coat pocket months ago had not been for his mistress, but a bribe for his mother. She had actively helped him hide my money, and he had rewarded her with diamonds. My grip on the heavy leather briefcase tightened until my knuckles ached. Eleanor stood near the sleek black town car, adjusting her emerald gown with a haughty sniff. She hadn't seen me yet. I stepped out of the shadows of my parked car, my dark charcoal business suit blending seamlessly into the falling dusk. I walked straight up my own driveway, my heels clicking a slow, deliberate rhythm against the pavement. Eleanor turned at the sound. The smug, aristocratic superiority instantly vanished from her heavily powdered face, replaced by a mask of sheer, sour disgust. "What are you doing here, Maya?" she demanded, stepping directly into my path to block the front steps. "This is a private family celebration. You have an incredible amount of nerve showing your face after everything you have put my son through." I stopped inches from her. I didn't shrink under her glare. I didn't lower my eyes. I looked directly at the glittering stones resting on her chest, then slowly brought my gaze up to meet her cold, judgmental stare. "I am here for the final walkthrough, Eleanor," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "Marcus insisted I hand over the keys in person." She let out a harsh, mocking sound. "Well, leave them on the porch and call a cab. You are ruining the atmosphere. We are toasting to Marcus and Chloe's future, a future completely free of your suffocating presence." I offered her a tight, polite smile. "Oh, I wouldn't miss this toast for the world." I stepped around her, easily brushing past her outstretched arm, and pushed open my own heavy mahogany front door. The noise inside was deafening. The foyer was packed with Marcus's relatives drinking expensive champagne and laughing loudly. Waiters carried silver trays of hors d'oeuvres across the imported Italian marble. The scent of white roses was thick and suffocating. As I stepped into the light of the crystal chandelier, the laughter nearest to the door abruptly died. The silence rippled outward like a stone dropped in a pond, spreading through the living room until the entire house went dead quiet. Dozens of hostile eyes turned to stare at me. Through the parting sea of arrogant in-laws, Marcus and Chloe walked toward me, the triumphant king and his new queen. Chloe was glowing in a stunning floor-length white designer evening gown. The fabric shimmered as she moved a dress that easily cost $5,000. My $5,000. She clung tightly to Marcus's arm, her massive new diamond engagement ring flashing under the lights for everyone to see. Marcus adjusted the cuffs of his tailored tuxedo, his chest puffed out with absolute authority. He stopped a few feet from me, flanked by his whispering cousins and glaring aunts. The Louis Vuitton luggage set he had demanded I pack earlier was sitting near the staircase. He kicked one of the heavy bags casually toward my feet, exactly as he had done in my worst nightmares. "Pack the rest of your bags," Marcus commanded, his voice echoing in the silent vaulted room. "This house has no room for a leech." Chloe let go of his arm and crossed her arms tightly over her chest. She looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. The same look she used to give me when she was pretending to be a struggling college student. "Did you hear him, Maya?" Chloe sneered, stepping closer so her expensive perfume washed over me. "It is time for you to go. You have leeched off his success long enough. You do not belong in a place like this." The entire room of relatives watched me, waiting for me to break. They expected tears. They expected me to fall to my knees and beg for mercy. They wanted the final pathetic submission of the blue-collar girl who had never truly fit into their elite, sophisticated world. I looked at the heavy briefcase in my hand. Inside rested the forensic accounting reports, the wire fraud evidence, and the undeniable proof of Chloe's criminal past. I thought about the federal investigators currently sitting in unmarked vehicles just down the street, waiting for my text message. I didn't cry. Instead, a slow, quiet, genuinely terrifying smile spread across my face. Chloe's smug expression faltered. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened aggressively against the silk fabric of her gown. "What is so funny?" she snapped, her voice rising in a shrill, nervous pitch. "You are getting thrown out on the street in front of everyone. There is absolutely nothing funny about being a broke, middle-aged loser." I let her nasty words hang heavily in the tense air. I looked around the room, making deliberate eye contact with Marcus's aunts, his cousins, and finally his mother, who had just stepped inside the front door behind me. I savored their sudden collective unease. My smile only widened. "Actually," I said, my voice perfectly calm and lethal, carrying easily across the silent room, "I think there is a very slight misunderstanding about what exactly we are celebrating tonight." Marcus rolled his eyes dramatically, letting out a heavy, exasperated sigh. "Do not make this harder than it has to be, Maya. We are getting a divorce. I am keeping the house, the business, and the assets. End of discussion." "You cannot keep something that does not belong to you," I replied, holding his gaze without blinking. For a fleeting second, genuine panic flashed behind his arrogant blue eyes. His stiff, confident posture faltered just a fraction. He looked at Chloe, who was staring at me with wide, suddenly fearful eyes, and then he looked back at me. "What are you talking about?" Chloe demanded, taking a step back. "Marcus is a senior partner at his firm. He pays for everything in this house. This is his property." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my polished heels clicking sharply against the marble. I kept my eyes locked on my husband, enjoying the quiet, absolute power of the moment. I listened past the heavy breathing of the crowd. I listened past the thumping of my own heart. Far off in the distance, barely audible at first, a faint, high-pitched wail broke through the cool evening air, the sound of approaching police sirens. "Actually, Chloe!" I said, my voice steady and completely unshaken as the sirens began to grow louder, echoing down the neighborhood streets. "This house belongs to—" Before I could finish the sentence, Marcus reached frantically inside his tailored tuxedo jacket. His movements were jerky, suddenly stripped of their smooth, practiced confidence. He pulled out a thick, folded piece of legal paper and held it up between us like a physical shield against the approaching noise outside. He shook the document at me, a desperate, manic grin spreading across his face as the flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the front windows of the foyer. "You really thought I was stupid, didn't you?" Marcus sneered, waving the heavy paper toward my chest. "You thought you could hide your little real estate empire from a corporate lawyer?" I looked down at the certified property deed he was waving, the forged document with my fake signature on the bottom line. I tightened my grip on my briefcase, listening to the screeching tires of the police cruisers slamming to a halt on my front driveway, and gave the signal. The flashing red and blue lights outside cut through the warm glow of the crystal chandelier, painting the terrified faces of Marcus's family in harsh, pulsing strokes. The screech of tires abruptly ceased, replaced by the heavy synchronized slamming of car doors on my front driveway. Marcus stood frozen, the forged property deed suspended mid-air in his trembling hand. The manic, arrogant grin had entirely vanished from his face, leaving behind a slack-jawed mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. He looked from the flashing windows to me, his elite lawyer brain short-circuiting as it finally processed the magnitude of his fatal miscalculation. I didn't scream. I didn't gloat. I simply threw my head back and laughed. It was a genuine, unrestrained sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the marble foyer, cutting through the suffocating scent of white roses and the stunned silence of the crowd. The women who had just been sneering at my charcoal business suit were now shrinking back against the walls, their champagne glasses trembling in their hands. "That piece of paper you are waving is legally worthless, Marcus," I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. I clicked open the heavy brass latches of my leather briefcase. The mechanical snap sounded as sharp as a gunshot in the dead silent room. I reached inside and pulled out the thick stack of premium watermarked paper bearing the county judge's unignorable, freshly stamped seal. "This is the irrevocable trust deed," I announced, holding it up so the entire room of his arrogant relatives could see. "Filed, finalized, and completely impenetrable. Your forged power of attorney was voided hours ago. I own Vanguard Properties. I own every single cent in the liquid operating accounts. And I own this house." Chloe dropped Marcus's arm as if she had been burned. The shimmering $5,000 white designer gown suddenly looked absurdly out of place on her rigid frame. "Marcus, what is she talking about?" she hissed, her voice rising in a shrill panic. "You said her accounts were frozen. You said you had the deed." I didn't give him a chance to answer. I reached back into the briefcase and pulled out the massive heavy binders Elias and David had compiled. With a violent, sweeping motion, I slammed them down onto the nearest silver catering tray. Crystal champagne flutes shattered, spilling expensive wine across the imported Italian marble, but no one dared to move a muscle. "And this," I continued, tapping the leather-bound covers, "is the complete forensic accounting report of your entire miserable existence for the past 6 months. Every dummy LLC, every offshore wire transfer, every single stolen dollar meticulously tracked and verified." Before Marcus could even open his mouth to formulate a lie, heavy, aggressive pounding rattled the mahogany front door. "Police, open up!" The door burst open, crashing against the entryway wall. A dozen uniformed police officers, flanked by 2 stern-faced federal investigators in plain clothes, flooded into my grand foyer. Their heavy combat boots trampled the scattered white rose petals into the marble. The engagement party was officially over. Marcus Sterling and Chloe Vance. The lead federal agent barked, his eyes scanning the terrified crowd before locking onto the couple standing under the chandelier. "Hands where we can see them, now." The chaotic fallout was absolutely magnificent. Chaos erupted as Marcus's aunts and cousins shrieked, scrambling over each other to back away from the center of the room, desperate to distance themselves from the golden boy they had been toasting just minutes ago. 2 officers moved in swiftly, grabbing Marcus by the shoulders and forcefully spinning him around. The metallic, rhythmic click of handcuffs echoing through my living room was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. Chloe immediately went into hysterics. Her sweet, innocent facade evaporated as an officer grabbed her wrist. She thrashed against him, her designer gown snagging and tearing on a nearby chair. "Get off me! I don't know what this is. I'm just his fiancé. I didn't do anything," she screamed, tears of pure self-preservation streaming down her face. I stepped forward, my polished heels crunching over the broken crystal. I pulled the final manila folder from my briefcase and tossed it directly at her feet. Glossy police mugshots spilled out across the floor. "Fiancé?" I asked, my voice carrying easily over her dramatic sobbing. "Is that what you called yourself in Chicago when you drained that cardiologist's pension fund? Or in Miami when you ran the exact same wire fraud scam under the name Elise Chloe Vance? If that is even your real name, is a professional grifter, a serial fraudster wanted in 2 different states." A collective gasp swept through Marcus's family. The aunts who had praised Chloe's youthful energy were now staring at her in absolute horror. The illusion of Marcus's perfect sweeping romance was completely shattered, exposed as nothing more than a cheap predatory con. Marcus was hyperventilating. His custom-tailored Italian tuxedo suddenly looked like a straitjacket. Sweat beaded heavily on his forehead, his slick, untouchable corporate lawyer persona completely dissolving into pathetic, undeniable desperation. He realized with crushing certainty that his elite firm connections could not save him from a federal indictment. "Wait! Wait! Listen to me!" Marcus yelled, his voice cracking as the officers began to read him his Miranda rights. "I'm a senior partner at Davis and Lockhart. I have assets, I can cooperate. You have the wrong person." He twisted his head, looking wildly around the room until his manic eyes landed on Chloe. The man who had been kissing her cheek just 10 minutes ago did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. "It was her!" Marcus screamed violently, thrashing against the officer's grip to point his cuffed hands at his struggling mistress. "She manipulated me. She set up the offshore shell companies. She forged the digital signatures to access the Vanguard accounts. I was just following her instructions. She's the mastermind." Chloe stopped struggling, her jaw dropping in sheer disbelief at the swiftness of his betrayal. Her tearful victim routine instantly hardened into venomous rage. "You lying, spineless coward!" she shrieked, lunging toward him before the officers yanked her back. "You recruited me. You gave me the security codes to her home. You bragged about bleeding your wife dry." The engagement party had devolved into a vicious, backstabbing crime scene. They were tearing each other apart right in my living room, fighting like cornered rats on a sinking ship, desperate to save their own skin. Standing near the front door, paralyzed with absolute horror, was Eleanor. My mother-in-law watched her golden boy son being dragged through the mud, her face ashen, her aristocratic superiority completely pulverized. The $12,000 diamond necklace she wore, the one bought with my stolen money, seemed to weigh her down like an anchor. Seeing her precious son, about to be hauled away in disgrace, finally snapped her out of her shock. She pushed her way past a bewildered waiter, her emerald evening gown swishing as she marched toward the federal agents. "Officers, stop this at once," Eleanor demanded, using her most authoritative, condescending tone. "There has been a terrible mistake. My son is a respected attorney in this city. He is a victim of this wretched woman's manipulation." She pointed a trembling finger at Chloe, then glared at me. "And of a vindictive, hysterical wife. Uncuff him immediately." The lead federal investigator didn't even blink. He looked Eleanor up and down with cold indifference. "Ma'am, step back. We have an airtight paper trail of federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy. Your son is facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary." Marcus heard the words 20 years, and his knees practically buckled. The remaining color drained from his face. He looked at the unforgiving eyes of the federal agents, then at the binders of undeniable forensic evidence resting on my table. He knew Elias had tracked every single cent. He knew there was no talking his way out of this, unless he offered them a bigger fish. Marcus's chest heaved as he looked at his mother. The panic in his eyes morphed into something cold, calculated, and deeply sociopathic. He was a drowning man, and he was ready to pull anyone under the water to keep himself afloat. "I didn't act alone!" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing shrilly in the foyer. He locked eyes with his horrified mother. The missing $400,000, I can tell you exactly where it is. Check the local onshore wealth management trust. My mother holds the account. Eleanor gasped, taking a stumbling step backward, her hand flying up to clutch the stolen diamonds at her throat. Marcus, what are you doing? I'm saving myself, he screamed back, completely unhinged. He turned desperately to the federal agent. She orchestrated the onshore hiding of the assets. She pushed me to do it, but that's not all. Marcus smiled a deranged, desperate smile, his eyes wild as he prepared to detonate the ultimate bomb. Check the estate records from 1998, Marcus yelled, ensuring every single relative in the room heard him. My mother didn't just hide Maya's money. She orchestrated the exact same fraudulent trust scheme to steal my father's entire fortune while he was dying in hospice. And I have the original unaltered documents hidden in a safety deposit box to prove it. The deafening silence that followed Marcus's frantic confession was heavier than any shout. He had just detonated a 20-year-old family secret right in the middle of my marble foyer, attempting to use his own mother's historic crimes as a bargaining chip to save his own skin. Eleanor's knees finally gave out. She collapsed onto the floor, clutching her throat, where my stolen diamonds had rested just moments before, gasping for air, as the federal agents hauled her golden boy son out the front door in handcuffs. I didn't stay to watch the rest of the Sterling family scramble like cockroaches in the sudden light. I simply picked up my leather briefcase, stepped carefully over the broken champagne flutes, and walked out into the cool evening air. The war was over. Now it was time for the executions. Karma did not just arrive, it hit with the devastating, merciless force of a runaway freight train. Over the next 48 hours, the local news cycle was completely dominated by the spectacular downfall of Marcus Sterling. But the true bloodbath happened behind the closed doors of federal holding cells. David and Elias kept me constantly updated from our command center, which we had finally moved out of that dusty rented room and into the pristine, secure executive boardroom of Apex Holdings. According to the federal prosecutor, loyalty between thieves was a myth. The moment Marcus and Chloe were separated in custody, they immediately turned on each other with a viciousness that left seasoned investigators stunned. Chloe, desperate to avoid a maximum security sentence, provided the feds with a detailed roadmap to the entire wire fraud ring, explaining exactly how Marcus used his legal expertise to launder money for her associates in Chicago and Miami. In retaliation, Marcus surrendered his hidden encrypted drives, handing over every text message, email, and forged signature Chloe had ever produced. They handed the authorities everything required to secure multiple federal convictions, effectively doing the prosecutor's job for him. The dismantling of Marcus's life was absolute. The elite downtown law firm of Davis and Lockhart didn't just fire him. They publicly severed all ties, issuing a scathing press release before the weekend was even over. Within 2 weeks, the State Bar Association moved to permanently strip him of his law license in absolute disgrace. The man who had worn custom-tailored Italian suits and sneered at my calloused hands was now sitting in a concrete cell facing decades of federal prison time, entirely stripped of his identity and his arrogance. But the fallout didn't stop with Marcus and Chloe. The blast radius of their hubris obliterated the entire Sterling family. Prompted by Marcus's desperate manic confession in my foyer, federal agents opened a massive investigation into Eleanor Sterling and the 1998 estate fraud. The arrogant aunts, uncles, and cousins who had gladly drunk my champagne and mocked my blue-collar roots were suddenly drowning in federal subpoenas and staggering legal fees. Their accounts were frozen pending investigation. Their social standing in their elite country club circles evaporated overnight. They were completely humiliated, financially ruined by their association with Marcus's extensive legal battles and the sudden glaring exposure of their generational deceit. While they burned to the ground, I aggressively reclaimed my empire. With the irrevocable trust activated and the criminal evidence filed, my powerhouse legal team moved like a highly coordinated strike force. We didn't just petition to reclaim the stolen assets, we sued for massive punitive damages. A superior court judge, appalled by the sheer brazenness of the embezzlement, granted our motions without hesitation. The offshore accounts were seized and repatriated. The $12,000 Marcus had spent on his mother's diamond necklace was forcibly liquidated and returned to my Vanguard accounts. I recovered every single cent they had attempted to bleed from me, plus interest. 3 weeks after the arrests, I attended their preliminary federal arraignment hearing. I didn't have to be there, but I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed the closure. I walked into the courtroom wearing a tailored white suit projecting an aura of absolute untouchable power. I took a seat in the front row of the gallery flanked by David and Elias. A heavy side door opened and the bailiff led them in. My breath hitched not out of sorrow but out of sheer, unadulterated triumph. Marcus shuffled into the courtroom wearing an oversized, bright orange jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were shackled with heavy iron chains. He looked sickly pale, his hair unwashed and thinning, his shoulders hunched in crushing defeat. The confident, untouchable corporate lawyer was completely gone. Behind him walked Chloe, stripped of her designer gowns and expensive makeup. She looked haggard and terrified, her eyes darting nervously around the sterile, wood-paneled room. As Marcus turned to take his seat at the defense table, his eyes found mine in the gallery. The power dynamic between us, which he had tried so desperately to manipulate and control, was permanently, irreversibly shattered. He looked at me, the woman he had underestimated, gaslit, and tried to destroy, and I saw genuine, suffocating despair wash over his face. He knew he had lost to a force of nature he fundamentally failed to understand. I didn't scowl. I didn't sneer. I simply held his gaze with eyes as cold and deep as the ocean, offering absolutely no mercy. He broke eye contact first, staring down at his shackled hands, his chest heaving with silent, pathetic sobs. My life moved forward with breathtaking speed. Vanguard Properties was booming, and Apex Holdings had just finalized a commercial merger that doubled my net worth. I bought new furniture for my house, purging every lingering trace of Marcus and Chloe. I reclaimed my sanctuary, filling it with bright light, fresh artwork, and profound peace. A month later, my assistant walked into my spacious corner office carrying the afternoon mail. Among the glossy envelopes and corporate memos was a standard, flimsy piece of paper stamped by the Federal Correctional Facility. I sat behind my massive mahogany desk overlooking the city skyline and sliced it open. It was a handwritten letter from Marcus. The handwriting was erratic, a desperate scramble of ink. It was a groveling plea from a broken man. He wrote pages blaming Chloe for manipulating him, blaming his mother for raising him with a warped sense of entitlement. He begged for my forgiveness. He begged me to remember the early years of our marriage, back when I was scrubbing floors to support him through law school. He pleaded for a second chance, stating over and over that he finally realized I was the best thing he had ever had, and that he foolishly threw it all away for nothing. I read the letter in the quiet luxury of my office. I felt no anger. I felt no lingering heartbreak. I felt absolutely nothing for the man who wrote it. I stood up, walked over to the heavy-duty industrial shredder humming quietly in the corner of my office, and fed the pages into the machine. I watched his desperate apologies be sliced into tiny, meaningless ribbons, and I smiled. I returned to my desk, opening a new file for a massive commercial development deal in the downtown district. I was in the middle of reviewing the blueprints when my office intercom buzzed. "Maya!" My assistant's voice came through the speaker, sounding hesitant and slightly confused. "I'm so sorry to interrupt. There is someone here to see you." "I don't have any appointments until 2 o'clock, I replied, keeping my eyes on the architectural plans. "Please ask them to leave their contact information." "I tried Maya," she said, her voice dropping lower. "But she's refusing to leave the reception area. She says it's an absolute emergency. It's, it's your mother-in-law. I froze my pen hovering over the blueprints. Send her in, I said softly, a dark, satisfying curiosity blooming in my chest. The heavy glass doors to my office slowly opened. I leaned back in my leather chair, preparing to face the arrogant, aristocratic woman who had sneered at my worn boots and actively helped hide my stolen money. But the woman who stepped into my office was practically unrecognizable. Eleanor Sterling looked completely destitute. Her posture, once straight and dripping with haughty superiority, was stooped and frail. Her hair was unkempt, the expensive dye job fading at the roots to reveal stark white. She was wearing a faded, wrinkled coat, and her hands were trembling violently. She stopped a few feet from my desk, looking at the luxurious office, and then at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a desperate, humiliating terror. "Maya," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking as she clutched her worn handbag to her chest. "Please, the federal agents. They froze all my accounts due to the investigation. The bank is foreclosing by the end of the week. They're taking everything. I have nowhere else to go. I am begging you. Please, can you give me the money to save my home?" Eleanor stood before my massive mahogany desk, looking like a hollowed-out, pathetic shell of the aristocratic tyrant who had tormented me for over a decade. Her hands, entirely devoid of the $12,000 diamonds and heavy gold rings she used to flaunt in my face, trembled violently as she clutched a cheap, faded handbag to her chest. She was weeping actual, desperate, hyperventilating tears, begging me for the capital to stop the bank from foreclosing on her ancestral home. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the pristine expanse of my corner office. I didn't feel a single shred of the intimidation or the desperate need for approval she used to instill in me. I didn't feel anger. I just felt a profound, chilling emptiness. "You sat at my dining table for 15 years, Eleanor," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yet it echoed with lethal authority against the glass walls. "You ate the expensive food I paid for. You slept in the luxury guest room I furnished. And all the while you looked down your aristocratic nose at me. You mocked the calluses on my hands, completely oblivious to the fact that you were actively conspiring with your golden boy's son to steal the very empire those hands built." "Maya, please, I am begging you," she sobbed, her knees physically buckling as she gripped the edge of my desk for support. "I was wrong. I was so foolish, and I am paying the price. But they are taking everything. I'll be on the street by Friday. I'm an old woman. I have nowhere else to go." "You are a co-conspirator in a federal wire fraud ring," I corrected her, my tone absolute ice, stripping away any illusion of familial mercy. "The fact that you aren't currently sharing a concrete cell block with Marcus is a miraculous failure of the justice system, not a testament to your innocence. You helped launder my money to fund your luxury lifestyle. You smiled and drank my champagne while watching him bring a professional grifter into my sanctuary." I reached forward and pressed the intercom button on my desk, never breaking eye contact with the weeping woman. "Sarah, please send building security up to my office. Mrs. Sterling is leaving permanently." Eleanor let out a sharp, devastated wail, a sound of total crushing defeat. But I had already turned my attention back to the commercial architectural blueprints spread across my desk. By the time the heavy glass doors clicked shut behind her, erasing her from my life and my airspace forever, I didn't even bother to look up. With the final, pathetic ghost of the Sterling family vanquished, I turned my absolute focus toward healing the deepest, most visceral wound they had left behind: my home. The house I had scrubbed corporate toilets and sacrificed my youth to build had been deeply tainted. Every time I walked through the grand marble foyer, I saw the sickening echo of their engagement party. Every time I stepped into the master suite, I felt the repulsive violation of Chloe's presence. I refused to surrender my sanctuary to their memory. I didn't just want to redecorate, I needed a total violent exorcism. The very next morning, I hired a premium aggressive demolition and design crew. We ripped out the imported Italian marble in the foyer, the cold stone giving way to warm, rich, hand-scraped mahogany. The glittering crystal chandelier that had illuminated Marcus's arrogance was taken down and literally smashed into the industrial dumpster. I completely gutted the master suite, knocking down walls to create a massive sun-drenched sanctuary featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the private manicured gardens. I purged the dark, sterile, oppressive colors Marcus had always insisted on, painting the walls in vibrant, breathing hues of emerald sapphire and brilliant gold that reflected my own resilient spirit. Over the course of 3 exhausting, exhilarating months, the house violently shed its old skin. It was no longer a monument to a dead, deceptive marriage. It was a fortress of absolute solitude and peace. The lingering nightmares finally stopped. I learned how to sleep deeply again, wrapped securely in the unshakable certainty of my own independence. As my physical home healed, my corporate empire exploded into a new stratosphere. Without Marcus's parasitic legal drain on my resources, Vanguard Properties and Apex Holdings experienced a period of unprecedented aggressive growth. I was closing massive multi-million-dollar commercial acquisitions with a newfound lethal confidence. The local business journals that had once eagerly reported on my ex-husband's spectacular, disgraceful downfall were now featuring me on their covers, detailing my unstoppable rise as one of the most formidable self-made female CEOs in the state. But the staggering financial success wasn't enough to satisfy the fire in my chest. The trauma of the betrayal had left deep silver scars, but it had also forged a fierce, unapologetic protective armor. I knew firsthand how easily a calculating, manipulative partner could use the complex legal system to weaponize a woman's own success and love against her. Working alongside David, my brilliant, unwavering lead attorney, and Elias, the ruthless former IRS investigator who had hunted down my stolen capital, I launched a new specialized division within Apex Holdings. We called it the Vanguard Shield Initiative. It was a comprehensive, heavily funded foundation dedicated exclusively to providing elite legal representation, aggressive forensic auditing, and emergency financial protection for women facing high net worth fraud and financial abuse by their spouses. We became the relentless, heavily armed cavalry I had so desperately needed a year ago. Watching terrified, gaslit women walk into my sleek boardroom only to leave hours later armed with ironclad legal strategies and the fierce advocacy they needed to reclaim their stolen lives provided a level of profound closure that no amount of profit ever could. I was taking my absolute greatest vulnerability and forging it into an impenetrable, lethal shield for others. The ultimate poetic culmination of my rebirth arrived exactly 1 year to the day after I had first discovered the horrifying truth hidden in Marcus's offshore transfers. It was Thanksgiving Day. Outside, a crisp, golden autumn wind swept through the neighborhood streets. But inside my beautifully transformed home, the air was overwhelmingly warm, vibrant, and alive. The rich, intoxicating scent of roasted turkey, fresh sage, and cinnamon-baked apples drifted from the chef's kitchen. Soft, soulful jazz played through the hidden speakers, mingling seamlessly with the booming, joyous laughter echoing down the hallways. I wasn't hosting arrogant, sneering in-laws or catering to a husband who secretly despised me. I was hosting my chosen family. David and his wife were sipping expensive vintage wine by the roaring stone fireplace, laughing at a story my assistant was telling. Elias, looking completely out of his usual sterile, intimidating element, was actually smiling warmly as he expertly carved the massive turkey at the kitchen island. My top executives from Vanguard, the loyal staff who had stood by me during the darkest, most terrifying days of the scandal, and the fiercely protective friends who had held my shattered pieces together, They filled my home with brilliant, undeniably beautiful life. I walked out of the kitchen carrying a heavy crystal tray of poured champagne flutes and stopped quietly at the edge of the grand dining room. The long, custom-made oak table was set impeccably glowing under the warm amber light of a new modern fixture. I looked around the room, silently absorbing the radiant, authentic joy of the people who truly loved, respected, and fought for me. The emotional wounds of Marcus and Chloe's sociopathic betrayal would likely always be there, a part of my history that I could never fully erase. But I had finally learned to trust my own immense, terrifying resilience. I had looked absolute orchestrated devastation directly in the eye and utterly refused to blink. David noticed me standing in the archway and raised his glass, bringing a sudden expectant hush over the bustling, happy room. Every smiling face turned toward me, their eyes filled with genuine admiration. I stepped up to the head of the heavy oak table. I was an African-American woman who had scrubbed public toilets in the dark, built a staggering empire in the light, and weathered the ultimate blistering storm to protect it. I picked up my champagne flute, the delicate crystal catching the dancing firelight from the hearth. To walking barefoot through the fire, I said, my voice steady, deeply resonant, and filled with profound, unbreakable peace. To the family we actively choose, to absolute, uncompromising strength and unyielding independence. I looked around at the beautiful, spectacularly successful life I had forged and protected with my own two bare hands, feeling a deep, magnificent thrill of victory settle permanently into my bones. And I added a slow, brilliant, victorious smile spreading across my face as I raised my glass higher into the warm light, to the absolute sweetest revenge of all,